Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
Thank you very much. I'm Philip Emeagwali. The modern supercomputer has existed for 3/4 of a century. The vector supercomputer has existed since the 1970s. In 1989, the vector supercomputer had $1 billion in sale. Today, the vector supercomputer has been replaced with the parallel supercomputer that in turn has a market size of $20 billion a year. A massively parallel supercomputer that is on a Japanese drawing board will cost $1.25 billion. In real-world computational physics, the supercomputer that cost $1.25 billion is an inexpensive alternative to physical experiments that range from modeling the flow of blood through the cardiovascular system to simulating the flows of crude oil and natural gas that are flowing 1 mile deep and flowing underneath the surface of the earth and flowing across the surface of the earth and flowing across a porous medium that is the size of a town. It is far cheaper to simulate a petroleum reservoir and do so without constructing a cumbersome physical scale model of the Niger Delta production oil field of the southeastern region of Nigeria. The extreme-scaled computational physicists don't actively inject water into the petroleum reservoir. The computational physicist plays a what-if simulation scenarios and plays that game with her parallel processed simulations of the multi-phase flows of crude oil, natural gas, and injected water. That high-resolution, extreme-scale petroleum reservoir simulation that is massively parallel processed across millions upon millions of commodity processors enables the petroleum geologist to be confident about pinpointing the locations of crude oil and natural gas. Back in 1989, I won the top prize in the field of supercomputing, and I won it for my contributions to the parallel supercomputer. The proof that my discovery was groundbreaking was that it made the news headlines and was highlighted in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. Prior to my discovery of parallel supercomputing that occurred on the 4th of July 1989, I did not have a record of making major scientific discoveries. Back in the 1980s, computational physicists rejected my research on the massively parallel supercomputer and did so in part because they could not understand how I was able to message pass computational fluid dynamics codes and do so to and from my 65,536 processors. Because message passing was unknown and was not in the textbooks of the 1980s, my parallel supercomputing research was rejected by research mathematicians on the grounds that it was not a subfield of mathematics. My parallel supercomputing research was rejected by research physicists on the grounds that it was not a subfield of physics, and computer scientists rejected my parallel supercomputing research, and did so because its computational fluid dynamics components, such as modeling the weather above and below the surface of the Earth, was also not a subfield of computer science. That rejection was the reason I was the only full-time programmer and the only person that developed the ability to parallel process across an ensemble of 64 binary thousand commodity off-the-shelf processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that shared nothing between each other, and that were identical to each other. But most importantly, I understood that I had to record a speed increase of a factor of 65,536 that was a world record in supercomputer speedup. I had to use that unprecedented speedup as my performance metric that will put a specific number on my contributions to the development of the modern supercomputer. I did not merely solve my initial boundary value problem on a processor or a computer. The reason I was the cover stories of top publications in mathematics was that I discovered how to solve initial boundary value problems arising in physics, calculus, and algebra, and discovered how to solve them across a new internet, that is a new global network of powers of two processors. My new internet was a new supercomputer, de facto, that is a million times more complex than a singular supercomputer that was powered by only one processor, that was not a member of an ensemble of processors. My discovery of that speedup across processors is my contribution to the development of the modern supercomputer. My contribution changed the way we do computational physics and changed it from sequentially processed small-scale computational physics to parallel processed extreme-scaled computational physics. My contribution to the development of the supercomputer changed the way we compute and changed it from slowly computing in sequence to supercomputing in parallel. My contribution to the development of the fastest supercomputer changed the way we compute and changed it from counting only one thing at a time to counting up to 1 billion things at once. My contribution to parallel supercomputing is a paradigm shift in computer science. Parallel supercomputing was vaguely mentioned as a science fiction back on February 1, 1922, and in the book titled Weather Prediction by Numerical Process. For 7 decades thereafter, parallel supercomputing remained in science fiction until I discovered it on the 4th of July 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States. My contribution to the development of the computer is this. I moved the parallel supercomputer from science fiction books to science textbooks. I was the lone wolf supercomputer scientist, supercomputer inventor that discovered parallel processing. My confidence as a parallel supercomputer scientist did not come from vector supercomputer scientists who in the first place believed that the massively parallel supercomputer will forever remain a huge waste of everybody's time. My confidence that I could solve the toughest problem arising in supercomputing came from within me and from the command of materials that I possessed. Confidence comes from being the most prepared and the most knowledgeable. Progress does not always come from always being right. Progress comes from not fearing to be wrong. There is a great difference between a scientific fact and a science fiction. Back on February 1, 1922, parallel processing was theorized for accurate weather forecasting, but the technology was not then a science fact, but was a science fiction. On July 4, 1989, and 67 years after parallel processing was described as a science fiction, I discovered that parallel science fiction. I discovered that parallel supercomputing is a science fact. It is a scientific fact. I once asked a friend why he left journalism to become a fiction writer. He said, journalism deals with facts, while fiction deals with truths. In the 1970s and 80s, my quest for the fastest supercomputer that was then hidden in the unknown world of massively parallel supercomputing was for a scientific truth, not a science fiction. My new parallel processed way of counting 1 billion things at once and across as many processors is a mathematical truth, not a mathematical fiction. The writer is a generalist. The poet chisels words. The novelist describes the human condition. But it's the scientific discoverer that changes the human condition. After 60 years, onward of June 20, 1974, of programming 16 supercomputers, I knew that no supercomputer scientist was on my heels in that race to become the first person to discover the world's fastest supercomputer that solves 1,000,000 problems at once or in parallel. The new supercomputer attained its world record speed across a new internet that was a new global network of 65,536 commodity off-the-shelf processors that were equal distances apart. On the 4th of July, 1989, I recorded and discovered the fastest possible parallel processed supercomputer speed. After my discovery, parallel processing became synonymous with supercomputing and became the gateway to extreme-scale computational physics and became the solution path to the toughest problems arising in mathematics. The supercomputer is the workhorse of mathematics and physics. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing was publicly unveiled at the awards ceremony of the 35th IEEE Computer Society's International Conference that took place on February 28, 1990 in San Francisco, California. I did not invent parallel supercomputing overnight. Should we value science more than literature? Literature describes, while science explains. Literature gave us parallel processing as a science fiction story and did so on February 1, 1922. But it was science that turned that science fiction into non-fiction and did so on July 4, 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States. The date and place that I discovered that parallel processing will forever remain the vital technology that makes computers faster and makes supercomputers fastest. Leonardo da Vinci was at the crossroad of science and art. The contributions to knowledge of great scientists like Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, and Marie Curie carried greater gravitas than the writings of great novelists like Ernest Hemingway, Charles Dickens, and Jane Austen. Unraveling the mysteries of the universe carries heavier gravitas than telling the story of a person. This is the reason that about 100 scientists have been portrayed on currencies, but William Shakespeare, that is considered to be the greatest writer of all time, is not on any currency. An airport or hospital or university can be named after a historical figure in science, but not after a historical figure in literature. International airports are named after Nikola Tesla, Copernicus, and Leonardo da Vinci, but none are named after William Shakespeare. The memorialization of words lacks the depth of that of scientists such as Albert Einstein or political figures like Nelson Mandela. A poem is not as important as the internet. A well-known poet confessed that his poetry is useless but not harmful. The storyteller cannot become the hero of the heroism he is basking in. The biographical writer's fame is a reflected glory that is achieved through writing about a famous person rather than through doing what made that person famous. 3 weeks after my 19th birth date in Nigeria, I received a scholarship letter from Monmouth, Oregon, United States, that was dated September 10, 1973. That scholarship letter opened the door for me to enter into the United States. I received that scholarship not because I was good looking, but because I was good in mathematics and physics. That first and subsequent scholarships were renewed for 16 years and renewed across 6 American universities. In February 1991, the last of those 6 universities did something it never did before in its 2-century history. That university devoted a special issue of its flagship quarterly publication to a supercomputer scientist named Philip Emeagwali that it described as one of the world's smartest humans. The essence of that story spread like wildfire and is repeated decades later and across social media and whenever the subject of conversation is about the world's smartest persons. When I was 5 years old, back in January 1960, I enrolled in St. Patrick's Primary School, Sapele, Western Region, Nigeria. For the 5-year-old, his frontier of mathematical knowledge is the arithmetical times table that was unknown to him, but was known to mathematicians that lived 5,000 years earlier and along the valley of the River Nile of Africa. When I was 9 years old, back in January 1964, I enrolled in St. John's Primary School, Abo, Midwest Region, Nigeria. For the 9-year-old, His frontier of mathematical knowledge was the quadratic equation of algebra. The quadratic equation taught in high school was derived over the past 4,000 years, dating back to North Africa. Growing up in the 1960s post-colonial Africa, I had no sense of the history of mathematical inventions. I had no sense of who discovered the times table. I had no sense of who invented the quadratic equation. I had no idea that 30 years later, I would be in major US newspapers for inventing 9 partial differential equations of calculus and for inventing the as many companion finite difference equations of algebra that in turn approximates those partial differential equations. As a small boy, growing up in the early years of post-colonial Nigeria, I presumed that the times table in my arithmetic textbook and the quadratic equation in my algebra textbook had been known to textbook authors since time immemorial. I presumed that Adam and Eve studied the quadratic equation in their Garden of Eden. As a teenager in Nigeria, my greatest epiphany was that the arithmetical times table and the algebraic quadratic equation did not spontaneously create themselves. As I grew, I learned that the partial differential equation of calculus were not known to our distant ancestors that hunted wildlife and gathered fruits. I learned that calculus was invented 3 centuries and 3 decades ago, and that the partial differential equation was invented merely a century and a half ago. As a small boy growing up in Nigeria, I had no sense that the earth was round. I had no sense that the earth is merely 4.6 billion years old. I had no sense that our universe is 13.8 billion years old. I had no sense that humans had merely roamed the earth for only 100,000 years. As a small boy in Nigeria, I thought that arithmetical and algebraic knowledge came fossilized with the dinosaurs, that we are the monstrous lizards that roamed the earth and did so from 252 million years ago to 66 million years ago. The contributions to science of scientists born in Africa will increase during the 21st century. And the reason is that by the mid-21st century, 1 in 2 children will be born in Africa. My country of birth, Nigeria, has 200 million people and is more than half the population of the United States and could be as populous as the United States, or 400 million people by the year 2050. In the year 2050, Africa could de facto become the face of humanity. For that reason, the African child born today will become the custodian of tomorrow's technology. Nigeria needs more scientists than the United States. If Africa has 60% of the world's arable land, why then is Africa importing food from Europe? The answer is that Africa lacks the knowledge that pertains to science and technology. We have African inventors, but no African inventions. Is there a school subject called African science? Is there an African quadratic equation? Is there an African medicine or African magic? Or is there an African law of physics? or an African supercomputer.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.